Welcome, guys, to the JPS podcast. And we are here with Mike Tuscherer, owner of Reactive Training Systems. Mike's a world champion IPF powerlifter and a world-renowned IPF coach. He's been powerlifting since 2001, I believe, and has won gold at the World Games and has a wealth of knowledge and experience in the lifting game. And he's one strong motherfucker. So welcome, Mike, and thank you for being on today, bro.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me.
So for those listeners who are unaware of what Reactive Training Systems is, Mike, I know you get asked this on every single podcast that you go on. Do you mind outlining the fundamental tenets of Reactive Training Systems?
Yeah, I mean, that's not so easy to do, to be honest. Like, we have some things that we're known for, but they're really tools that we use. For example, we're for using and to a large extent popularizing RPE-based training. And it's true, we use that a lot, but it's also just a tool that we use. And, in some situations, it's not an appropriate tool or not the best tool. So we definitely don't have a problem using a different tool. It's definitely about what's going to produce the best results for the lifter, and not trying to get, I guess known for is a just fine description. We're kind of known for higher volumes in training and
Sorry,
maybe...
Mike. It just cut out there
Sure.
when you started explaining the RPE. Sorry, man, the internet connection just didn't hold up.
Sure. Do you record the video for this, or do you just post audio?
No, I record the video.
Do video as well?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I got up to
Should
RPE.
Okay. Just that, I guess what I was saying is that, RPE is definitely a tool that we use, and we use it, whenever the situation warrants that we use it, whenever it's the best tool for the job, It's something that we're known for a lot, but we try not to get married to any particular technique or method. And another example of that would be volume and frequency. We also are somewhat known for being a group that pushes higher volumes in training and higher frequencies in training. And that's true as well, that we definitely go toward that with a lot of lifters. But there are definitely some lifters who don't respond well to that, and we won't push them that direction. It's not...
Yeah.
We don't push people in that direction because it's an absolute. We only push them in that direction if it's something that they're responding well to.
Awesome. And a couple of brilliant points there. I don't think any coach should be married to any tool at any stage in their career. And with the RPE scale, so obviously this was derived from endurance sports, and in the strength and conditioning world, RIR, reps in reserves, is, the correct terminology. For those listeners who may not be aware of what the RPE scale is, do you mind outlining what this means for you and how it applies to strength athletes?
Sure. RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion, and as you mentioned, it comes predominantly from endurance sports, and we've kind of borrowed it and changed it around a bit and tried to make it applicable for strength sports, and in particular repetition-based activities. So the types of lifting that you'd most often come in contact with if you're a powerlifter or a bodybuilder or something like that. So it's a 1 to 10 scale, and it's basically a rating of how hard did it feel. Although I like to tell people these days that it's not this hyper emotional feeling. It's not how hard did it, like, oh, it felt really heavy. It's not that. It's a rating of your performance, and we do that based on, at least toward the upper end of the scale, on kind of a reps in reserve sort of thing. So, for example, a 10 RPE is a maximum effort. That's as hard as you can go in terms of completing the repetitions of the set. A 9 RPE is going to be 1 rep left in the tank. An 8 RPE is going to be 2 reps left in the tank. But after that, it gets a little bit further away from the reps in reserve paradigm. and there's kind of a chart that we have made and published online that outlines, what each level is and kind of the definition for each one. And it does a couple things for us. One is it allows us to communicate really clearly between a lifter and a coach. So say you're a lifter and you get done with a set and you say that was a 9 RPE, then I know what that felt like to you, and I know what I intended for it to be, and I can see any sort of mismatch and things like that. Now, if you do a set and you come away and go, that felt really heavy, I don't really know what that means. Like, do you mean that hyper emotional, like, oh, it felt really heavy on my back? Yeah. Or do you mean like it's an assessment of your performance? Like, what does that mean? And there's a lot of follow-up that needs to happen there to get the communication opened up. And I think RPE cuts through a lot of that. But it also gives us a way to auto-regulate the intensity, auto-regulate the weight on the bar. What I mean by that is, if I send you to the gym and ask you to do a triple at a 9 RPE, then you're going to put whatever weight on the bar that you need to get that triple at a 9 RPE. So that means if you're having a good day, or if you're just stronger, the training program is working like we hope it should, then that's going to be more weight than normal, Yeah. And conversely, if you're having a bad day, things aren't going your way, then it'll be a little bit less weight than normal. So that's a really nice feature of RPE, as well as that regulating effect.
Awesome. And yeah, the RPE scale is something that I've used both personally when I was powerlifting, and I also use it now that I'm transitioning towards bodybuilding. And it's something I've used a lot with my clients. And the other alternative to RPE is percentage-based prescriptions. And you've written countless times about percentage-based programs versus RPE scale, and how they're both tools to be used in the right context. So what context would give rise to you using a percentage-based program, Mike?
Okay, so the strengths of RPE are kind of what we talked about, that it gives you that auto-regulated effect, it opens up clear communication, and so on. Some of the weaknesses of RPE is that it can be difficult to use the further down the scale you go.
Yep.
So a 10 RPE is pretty obvious. If you do a set and you just grind out the last one and you crack a filling, that's a 10 RPE, obvious. 9 RPE is pretty obvious as well. 8 RPE is starting to get a little bit more fuzzy, but it's still pretty reliable. But 7, especially into 6, 5 RPE, that really submax effort work, that's hard to put a rating on. Is it a 6 or a 6.5?
Yeah.
It might have been a 5. It's hard to say it's exactly this. And usually, if you're working in that type of submax effort zone, like, what are the consequences of being off plus minus 5%? In terms of the weight that you load on the bar. Well, it's a little bit harder, a little bit easier than maybe it should have been. It's really not the end of the world, So if you kind of consider that a normal athlete in normal circumstances, a big swing in day-to-day performance would be like 5% swing in capability.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess, the big end of normal. Like, if you had a 5% swing, it wouldn't be unheard of, but it would be like, wow, that's unusual. I wonder what happened, So, that I kind of use that to gauge what I expect. Now if I have you do 90% for a triple, a 5% swing in performance could be disastrous.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm having you do 80% for a triple, now keep in mind that the average lifter can do 8 reps with 80%. If I have you do 80% for a triple and we're off by 5%, give or take, I mean, it's a little bit harder, a little bit easier than it should have been, so the consequences aren't so severe. So I guess that's kind of a long way around of what I'm getting at. In a situation like that, where you're working in the really submax effort zones, I would much rather just use the percentage, put a weight on the bar, and move on with things rather than do a lot of hand wringing over whether we've got exactly a 5 or exactly a 6 RPE.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the main. And
Awesome.
I wouldn't say that's the only one, but that's probably the main. Yeah.
Perfect, perfect. And that makes complete sense. And you've spoken before about how personality types and people who have controlled aggression will be suited best to using RPE. So, do you have any checks and balances in place when you're working with an athlete to help get an assessment of, whether they're assertive, overly aggressive, or controlled aggressive, and whether or not, that gives you an idea as to how to regulate their RPEs and so forth?
Well, that's a good question. We don't really do a lot of testing on it
Mm,
currently, but this is an area that I'm getting more and more interested in all the time. Um, yeah, and I do think that you want to have that sort of control aggressive mindset if you're going to use RPE. You have to want to put some more weight on the bar. And usually that's not a problem for lifters, although,
mm,
as the sport grows in popularity, you get a more and more diverse set
mm,
of people participating in
100%.
it. So yeah, so it's more common than it used to be to have people who are content to just lift the same weights every week,
Yeah.
Um, but that doesn't work so well. Like all things being equal, add a little bit more weight to the bar. That's kind of a good default mindset to have, And then of course, if your RPE indicates that um, things aren't going so well, that's where the controlled and controlled aggressive comes into play. You have to be able to
Pull back.
pull the throttle back a little
Yeah.
bit, and but yeah, the whole personality thing I think is fascinating, and we're starting to do some more looking into on personality details and stuff like that, and not just from an RPE standpoint, but from an overall programming standpoint. We see lots of things that so far have just been kind of casual observations, like
Mm,
kind of noticed, think and act this way. Um, you know, People who think and act this way do one thing,
yeah.
and then people who think and act this other way, they do better if we program this other way, and things like that. So I want to start peeling back the layers on that a little bit
Yeah.
more, see if I can figure out maybe there's a bit more to it.
Mm, it's very cool. It's very cool. And
Yeah.
what do you see to be the common issues besides the obvious, which are people not having a good understanding of, how hard things are perceived subjectively versus objectively? What are the common issues you see with people trying to use the RPE scale? Are there any issues, like glaring issues, that you've noticed over the years when watching people apply this tool?
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess probably the biggest one is accurate rating. I
Mm,
mean, that would be the main source of error. I mean, otherwise it's a fairly simple tool to use.
yeah,
So accuracy of rating is probably the big thing, but it's not, an intrinsic capability. It's not like you can either do it or you can't.
yeah,
It's definitely a skill that you get better at with practice. And that's why if I do send somebody to the gym and ask them to do a triple at a 9 RPE, and they come back and say they did a triple at a 10, or worse, they missed the third rep,
yeah.
I don't get too bent out of shape about it. I mean, no, it's not what I wanted them to do. It's not ideal. But if they learn something from it and they're more accurate at rating RPEs in the future, that's a price that I'm willing to pay, because
Mm,
okay, yeah, that one set was not ideal and that may throw things off here in the short or midterm. But if you learn something valuable from that, then that's going to carry forward to every set that you do from here on.
for sure.
So that's a trade I'm willing to make more often than not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. And one of the major criticisms of the RPA scale, which is something that Johnny Candido has brought up, and I know you've replied and responded online, I definitely watched that, but is the psychological factors, and for the more advanced athletes, not knowing what they're going in to hit on a specific day can sometimes make visualizing that lift a little bit harder, and it can also make peaking a little bit more difficult to manage. So can you outline for the listeners your response to these criticisms of RPE?
Yeah, sure. I don't think that you should go into the gym with no idea of what you're doing. Um, if I sent you to the gym and said do a triple at a 9 RPE, there's a little bit of homework that needs to be done for that. Ideally, you would figure out what your target weight was going to be. And as you work up to that, you're monitoring your RPE, with an eye on that target weight. And then if things are looking good, then you'll hit that target weight. You may push a bit past it. If things are looking not so good, then you'll pull the throttle back and go below that target weight. It's just something to aim at. And that works way better than just going to. So you wouldn't go into the gym, with no plan. You definitely would have a plan for at least what that target weight is going to be. And you may plan a little bit more, but the idea of RPE is that you're going to modify that plan based on the day's actual real world performance. And we even have kind of built that into some of our online systems. So for example, we've got an online training log that we use that's actually free for anybody to use. Anybody that wants to use it, you can just sign up for a free login on the website, and there you go. You've got access to an online training log for free. And as part of those tools, there's a workout planner where it will look at your previous performance of that exercise, and you tell it what you want to do today. Today I want to do 5 reps at an 8 RPE or whatever, and it'll come up with a projected weight, a goal weight for you, and so you can add that into your training plan for the day. But it's something that you have in front of you, something to look at going into the gym. And I think that actually helps lifters peak better because it's a plan that adapts to them. What I see happen to some lifters that have a plan maybe too rigid, and they get a bit too invested into that plan as they start to approach the competition. Let's say one workout doesn't go quite so well, well, in the next workout, they try to make up for it,
Yeah,
and
definitely.
so that ends up being a bad training decision. And so that workout goes poorly as well. And that snowballs into the next one and the next one and the next one. And so it makes it so that one bad training session can create a bad training decision that snowballs for weeks, So that's no good. You need to have some way to kind of break that cycle. So the target weights, I think, are a good way to do that, because they look at last week's performance and say, okay, forget about where you wanted to be. Forget about, the ideal situation. This is where you are. This is the most current information we have on your performance abilities right now. So let's improve on that a little bit, and I think that's the best way to go about it. Now, if you can design a training program that works for the athlete, and the athlete's getting stronger and stronger and stronger, that will still work. It says, hey, last week you set a PR. That's where you're at right now. So this week, let's try to build on that a little bit. And let's say you just have another fantastic week. You set another PR, maybe bigger than you expected. Well, that's great too. So next week, we'll take that information. This is where you are now, and build on that. So it snowballs things in a good way,
Definitely. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, obviously there's a lot of gender differences that influence training, response to training, and everything else in between. How have you found females and males to respond to the RPE scale? Are males more consistent in that we don't have this special thing once a month, versus the females who obviously have the menstrual cycle, which has seen their strength fluctuate? Have you noticed, using the RPE scale, that you're able to adapt to that better? And is there big differences between genders in terms of consistency in training?
I haven't looked at it that closely. I haven't looked at gender differences that closely, to be honest.
Mm.
It's a thing that, whether those differences exist or not, I feel like the RPE has a distinct benefit.
Mm.
And if those differences are there, then it will have even more of a
Yeah,
benefit.
exactly.
And so it's not been a matter of mitigating any potential downsides. It's like, well, uh, the worst case scenario is this is a good tool to use. The best case scenario is it's better than we expected.
Yeah.
So it's just not been a huge priority to
Yeah,
look
yeah.
into it. In a more general sense, I mean, it's kind of an interesting spot, right? That just gender differences in general in strength training, because on a practitioner standpoint, there's some things that we've noticed, some tendencies that we've noticed, but as we start to look at things a bit more closely, sometimes those gender differences kind of disappear a little bit. For
Definitely.
instance, it's kind of common knowledge that women tend to be better at repetitions at a given percent of 1 rep max than men are. Now, we looked at that in our recent Project Momentum that we did, and if I look at the average repetitions on a movement, differences between men and women, there really aren't any. Excuse me, the average repetitions at 80% for both men and women was 8 or 8.6, somewhere in there, but they were really, really similar. Now, there are some confounding variables there too. Like, I didn't really look at it, at other potential issues. Like, I don't remember looking to see if there were Wilks score differences between the two. And our sample size of women was a lot smaller than the sample of men. So there's some potential issues there, but it's interesting at least, that this is a population of people who I would normally work with, and there's a perceived difference, but now when I look at it a bit closer, maybe there's not as much of a difference in that way, Another thing that we tend to notice is that women tend to be able to handle greater training stresses and training volumes in general. And that one does seem to bear out. The women that I've worked with, say the women with the highest work capacity that I've worked with can far and away handle more training workload than the men with the highest work capacity. But there's some interesting confounding variables there too. The main one being body weight. The lifter I'm thinking actually is an Australian lifter, Liz Craven. Yeah, she can handle an insane amount of training volume, but I don't have that many 52 kilo men that I work with that to compare her against, So the body weight difference, I think it matters, How much does it matter? Well, I really don't know at this point. And again, in a practical setting, it turns out that it's probably not that important, because all this information does is hopefully it gives us a decent starting point. And you probably have that anyway. You probably have a decent starting point just because you've been training. You have a bit of training history. Yeah. So what has worked so far, there we go. That's a starting point. And from there, we can manage some experimentation and look and see what the real world effects of the training are. And we'll be able to manage future training adjustments from there.
Brilliant. A lot of really important points there. So obviously in most cases, unless we have, a lot of information on somebody, start with very broad generalizations we know work for most people. And then over time we collect data, which is obviously critical to the success of programming. So outside of RPE, what is the other information you collect on your lifters to assess their response to training? So obviously numbers on, the weight on the bar is going to be the big one, but what are some other things you're looking at when assessing response to program?
Well, if we're talking specifically about response to training, then I'm looking at the training log and I'm looking at their track data.
Yep.
Track is another free tool that we have on the website. It's an athlete monitoring tool. There's a heart rate test and a subjective questionnaire, and essentially it gives you some insight on how well the athlete is recovered, how well are they recovering, how well are they adjusting to a given training load. And that's like, think of that like the temperature gauge on a car.
Yeah.
You can tell how hot the engine's running, and if it's running too hot, then maybe things need to throttle back a little bit, so that's one thing that we look at. And the other thing that we look at probably most often is the lifter's estimated 1RM. And that's derived from their training log. So by looking at their training log, we can tell, are they progressing? How fast are they progressing? And then looking at their track data, we can tell how well they're recovering. And that's probably the most interesting things in terms of measuring training response. I mean, Those are the two things that you care about. Training response is what you're after. You want that estimated 1RM to be going up. And then the track information gives us an idea of, are we pushing things too hard or not hard enough and things like that. And from there, the other training metrics that we can look at, things like volume, intensity, exercise selection, and, all the rest. All that stuff is useful in determining what did we actually do to create X training effect. So say you have a training block. When you look back at that training block, you go, wow, the estimated 1RM really shot up during this training block. Now you have to say, okay, what was it about that training block that produced that result? Because there's always a lot of things going on in a training block. Some things are common to all the training blocks. Well, we did we did a moderate intensity block. Lots of sets of 5. Well, if we look back through the other block reviews that we've got, maybe we find that sometimes we do sets of 5 and it's great. Sometimes we do sets of 5 and it's terrible. Well, okay, so that maybe isn't the main thing that the main piece of information that we're looking for. What else can we find? We did pin squats, and every time we do pin squats, we have a good training cycle. Well, that's really important information to know.
Yeah.
And that way you have a lifter that's training up for a major competition, going to nationals or something like that, or whatever their major competition is. Well, you can make sure to have those essential components in the program, and it gives you an idea for what things still need some experimentation.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And in saying that, obviously when you find what works, it's very hard for coaches to not get married to a certain protocol or a method, because when something's working, we can be reluctant to change. And this is definitely something I'm sure you've experienced, I've experienced at times. So what are your tips and what checks and balances do you have in place to ensure that with your programming you stay open-minded and aware of your own personal biases?
Well, a lot of it is relying on that log, and it's building a training process that, so I don't think you can rely on your subjective gut feel, sort of emotional tugs when it comes time to write the training program. I think you need to have developed a training process that gets around as much of that as possible. So to give you an idea, let's say I've got a lifter who's training up for one of those major competitions. So if they were training for a minor competition, we may be a bit more experimental. We may say, well, we know that this works, but we don't know about these other things. And I think, I'll just get an idea that, from looking at past training blocks, maybe you would respond well to a really low intensity or whatever, So when you're further away from a major competition, that's the time to increase your experimentation and gather that really essential information so that you have it when it's time to to train for a big one.
Definitely.
And that's not random experimentation either. You should do things that you expect will work. They're educated guesses.
Yep.
So the more educated you can be, the better off.
Yeah.
But then when it's time to train for those major competitions, you don't want to leave things up for chance. So you decrease the amount of experimentation that you're doing. So what I do in a situation like that, I'll go back through those block reviews and say, okay, so when we train like this and like this and like this, that's what produced the best results. Okay. And I apologize for being so vague on it, but it's just by definition a conceptual thing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's, some people you're going to find out that they respond really, really great to high frequencies. Other people, it's more about an exercise selection. Other people, it's about an intensity. It could be, it's not, just anything, but, there's a pretty wide range of things that an athlete can respond really well to. And you don't want to get too pigeonholed into looking at just one thing. You're looking for that training strategy that produces the best results for this athlete. So you would go back through those block reviews and construct a training cycle that's based on the best results for that athlete. So to give you an example, there are things that I'm finding out that work pretty well for my bench press, but they're not the same things that will work well for someone else's bench press. Yeah. And I think if we're kind of left up to our own devices, the tendency is to project our own experience onto the client, Definitely. And that's why I think it's important to have some sort of a process that gets you away from that.
Yeah.
Something that says, hey, this client really responds well to super high intensities. And you'll get a little nervous programming that. You're like, oh man, like if this was my program, this would be a bad idea, but that for this person, it's great because you've done it already and it's been great. Now it's not a guarantee that it's going to be great this time around, but I mean, you're a lot more certain of that than you would be of just, pulling an idea out of thin air.
Definitely. Some great tips there. And yes, it is such a hard thing to answer because it's very conceptual in nature, but I appreciate you bearing with me there. And
No. I enjoy the conceptual stuff. I just know that
so do I. So obviously everybody adapts very differently to training. That's why individualizing programs is so important. And adaptable lifters, so there's going to be obviously some people who just respond better to certain things than others. And at what point does an athlete need to get to before you recognize that they've stopped adapting to a specific protocol? Is it like performance is going down? Is it things are slowing down? Like when do you say, okay, now we'll try something different or look to different ways to program for that person?
Well, nowadays it's kind of an ongoing process. Before when we found an effective training strategy for someone, I would kind of let them sit on it and just extract everything that they could out of it. And when, the results had more or less tapered off, we'd start looking for something else. But now the process is a lot more blended, so what we'll do is look at their competition schedule. And if I have a couple development cycles that I can experiment with, that's great. That's, we'll look a little bit more, and it kind of depends on what we know about the athlete. If we haven't tried anything that's worked, and unfortunately that happens sometimes. There was one lifter in particular I was coaching, and every time I would give him something that, hey, I, thought it was going to work, otherwise I wouldn't have given it to him. His lifts just didn't go anywhere. And at one point he was starting to get frustrated, and he said, maybe I should just do a bodybuilding training block or two. All right, fine.
Over to the dark side.
Yeah. Something that's very different from, the frustrations that he was experiencing, and whenever we put him on that program, his strength went up. And I was like, well, that's weird, totally not expected,
Yeah, right.
But, so we repeated that experiment a couple times, and, yeah, it kind of bore out that for this guy, he just responded better to things that were a bit higher rep, a bit more volume, a bit less intensity focused, and things of that nature.
Yeah, right.
So if you have somebody like that who you're trying some things and nothing seems to work, then you experiment a bit more wildly.
Yeah.
Not wildly as in random, but just you're more willing to make some big changes. Now, if you have somebody who you already have a pretty good picture, you've worked with them for a while, you know these are the things that they tend to respond well to. I mean, you don't need to make huge sweeping changes to that, but it's a good idea to maybe try some different exercises, maybe try modulating the intensity a bit wider than you normally would, or changing the frequency or something like that, just so you put a little bit more tools in the toolbox. If you only have one set of exercises, one set of intensities that produce results for a lifter, well, then basically you can put together one effective training block, and that's not a real great long-term plan to get you into a competition. Now, if you can find 2 or ideally even 3 really, really effective training blocks for a person, then, I mean, that's a really great situation. And that's a situation where you may really reduce the amount of experimentation, because you've got to
cycle through.
Yeah, you've got a good arsenal of things at that point, So really just if you had 3 really good training blocks, you could probably milk that for a year or more. You're gonna have a good couple years there, I think.
That's the dream. A good couple of years, hey?
Yeah. You can get a long way in a good couple of years.
Yeah, exactly right. So something I wanted to get your thoughts on today, Mike, a little bit outside of RPE and all of the program design discussion, although it still obviously relates to that somewhat, is overload work and super maximal loading for improving 1 rep max strength. So you've recently uploaded a video which I suggest all the listeners go and watch on knee wraps and the slingshot. I've used the slingshot to great effect, whether that was because of physiological reasons or psychological reasons, just having that confidence with heavier loads in my hand. What would be your reasons for implementing these tools into a program, and when would it be appropriate for a lifter?
First, I think it's important to say that whether the effect was psychological or physiological, I mean, it doesn't really matter too much if you're a powerlifter. Right. Yeah. If your lift went up, then your lift went up. They don't take 10 pounds off your total because your gains were psychological in nature. So yeah, I mean, if it works, then it works. Yeah. And it's not that why isn't important. It is important, but it's important for a different reason.
Exactly.
That knowing that something works or that it doesn't work is probably the most important, and then why can come a bit later, because so often, knowing why and then reasoning out something additional doesn't really pan out. Like, that's why we actually have to do experiments and things like that.
Yeah.
But back to the superloading overload work, it's something that I find is effective for a good number of lifters. I hesitate to say the majority. I don't know if it's really a majority or not, but it's not uncommon at all for me to find lifters that it's effective for. It's so common, in fact, that it's kind of the default position for me, at least in the bench. We have a little bit more, available movement slots in a given training week for bench training. You're not going to squat, you're not going to do 6 different exercises a week for your squat, probably,
You would beat up.
3 tends to be, I mean, that's just a lot.
Yeah.
So for the bench, we include it a lot more often, but I've still found it to be effective for the squat and the deadlift as well. Ways to do it. Like you mentioned, I like the slingshot. I like knee wraps in the squat because you still feel the entire weight as it is through the full range of motion. Even if you have some sort of material assistance at certain joint angles and around certain joints, that's different for sure. But at least you have the full load in your hands, the full load on your back, and I feel like that's important. Not essential, but useful. If you don't have access to knee wraps, or you don't like knee wraps or slingshot or whatever, then chains and bands and stuff like that works just fine. Partial range of movement, that stuff works just fine. And we do that pretty regularly as well. But it's a thing that, I like to try it and see, do we get a positive result from it or not? And if we don't, then we'll use that slot for something else. But it's not at all uncommon that we see people that get a positive transfer from it. As far as explaining why, I don't know. I feel like that's a little bit outside of my scope.
Yeah.
I know that a lot of people have looked at it, and people, pose different explanations for it. And, there's much greater debate as far as why it works, and that's fine. But I think more work needs to be done there. And just because we, can't currently rationalize it or, can't conceptualize it, that doesn't mean that the phenomenon is not true. Like we see people that do it and get a result from it. So, that is the thing. And it's not something that should be ignored, especially for upper level athletes.
Yeah.
You're not seeing a result just from anything that you do, so when you do see a result, it's much more likely due to something that you did different,
Yeah, for sure. So many good points there. And I think the most important one is that sometimes what we see in practice is ahead of what researchers are able to deduct and reason in terms of finding out why certain phenomenons occur. Sometimes the bros in the gym are a little bit ahead of the science in that sense, and it doesn't mean that we should remove protocols or stop doing something just because we can't find out or explain 100% why that is.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the people in the gym are going to be, in some ways, they're going to be ahead, right? Just by like if you consider that people in the gym are free to experiment a lot wider and a lot faster than people in a more laboratory setting. So in some ways they're going to be ahead, but they're going to be wrong a lot more often as well.
Oh yes.
So yeah, it just depends on how well do you want to, like, how sure do you want to be of it? If you require a 95% confidence that something that you're going to add works, then yeah, you should probably stick to published research. But even then, you're talking about, confidence in what's going to be effective for the average person.
Exactly right.
And truth be told, you're not average, and things that are working for the average person may not be effective for you.
Definitely.
So
study designs aren't also replicating or indicative of what occurs in the real world. Like I'm sure there's not too many studies that have people squatting 90% or above, using knee wraps, slingshots, for example, and things like this.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because and that's a big part of the drive for why we started doing Project Momentum.
Yeah.
We wanted to test some of these ideas in a more practical setting. The idea was not to, shed any light on, an esoteric training phenomenon or anything like that. It's not about trying to get it published in a journal or contribute to big S science. It's more about looking at how do things pan out in a practical setting. Is there anything that we can learn about what we should do as coaches to make things more effective for people in the gym? Providing that great starting point. That's what we want to do as coaches, is provide a training program that's a really great starting point, and then learn from the athlete response so that we can get an even better program the next block around. So yeah, I think it's important to have an understanding of both, and just I guess to have a bit of literacy about it, to know
Mm,
what the potential limitations of it are, to
definitely.
understand a bit more about individual variants. That was a really interesting thing that we figured out in the last. I mean, I shouldn't say we figured it out in the last project, but it was apparent in the last project that we did. So we were doing this 80% rep test, um, and trying to figure out if how many reps you could do with 80% told you anything about how you should train. And it turns out that it indicates a little bit. If you can do, like I said, the average reps at
Was
80%
eight.
is right around 8. So if you can do more than 8 reps with 80%, then it indicates you should probably train with fewer reps and heavier weights. If you can do low reps at 80%, meaning less than 8, you should probably train with higher reps and slightly lower weights. Um,
Right.
you know, we wanted to kind of test that idea in a practical setting, but the difference wasn't huge. And there were some people, well, let me back up for a second. So basically, what it indicated was people that trained what they were bad at, on average, got a better result than people who trained what they were good at. But there were some people who trained what they were bad at that didn't do so well. And uh, some people who were training what they were good at that did great. Now those were more of the exceptions rather than the rules. But if you were to ask one of those people, what they thought, that would be the most important data point for them.
Yeah.
You know, um, if you did everything that you were supposed to but got a bad result, then I mean, maybe you should try doing things you're not supposed to and see if you get a
Yeah.
better result, because getting a better result is obviously preferable. you know.
Definitely. And I really respect that, as a coach, you're continually trying to learn more, and you're bringing the research into a very practical setting and conducting that yourself. I do have a lot of respect for that, and it's something that I think needs to occur more of. And I know there's a number of strength and conditioning coaches who are starting to collect athletes to observe them and watch them over time and whatnot now, which is awesome to see. And one of the last questions I have for you today, Mike, is how do movement mechanics influence training frequency? So I've heard you speak a lot about the example of Liz Craven, who trains 4 times a week, versus Mark Robb, who trains 3 times a week. So what are the factors that differentiate between them, and what warrants you to make that decision in terms of their frequency?
Good question. As far as like distilling it down into a specific why, and especially in terms of taking it to the level of mechanics, I'm not sure that I can do that, or that uh, I could say with any sort of certainty that that's the factor. So, for example, Mark. Let me start at the other position. So, just to give a bit more background, uh, Liz trains with a higher frequency, and she can push the training volumes to fairly superhuman levels, and get really great returns on that. But then when I was working with Mark Robb, who's a Masters 2 athlete, he's been training for 30 years. He's got a pretty extensive injury history.
Yeah.
Now he's still, top shelf athlete. He's multi-time world champion, world record holder, and whatnot. His training was 3 sessions per week. The frequency was a bit lower, and we had to deload much, much more frequently, like every third week versus every sixth or seventh week
Yeah.
with Liz. So, so there was a big disparity there. Now, some additional observations. Let's take the squat, for example. Liz, I would say, is more mechanically built to squat than Mark is, but I don't know to what extent that is the driving factor between the differences in training volume. Like we said, there's a pretty enormous difference in body weight. Liz is 52 kilos. Mark is 110 kilos.
Yeah.
There's a pretty significant difference in age and time under the bar as well as training history. So what really drove that decision for me was more looking at the training results. Again, going back to estimated 1RMs and track scores. We started them, and I couldn't say that we started them from a similar starting program. I doubt that's true. But I remember that wherever we started Mark, after a couple weeks, it was apparent that it was too much.
Yep.
We're looking at his track scores, the engine's running too hot. So we had to pull things back. And when we did that, the results he was getting improved. It's a little counterintuitive when you think about it on a surface level. Well, he did less training and got better results.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Because his recovery was a lot better, So it's not so counterintuitive if you think about it a bit more deeply. And Liz kind of had the opposite experience. Wherever we started her out from, she was well recovered. So whenever we needed to push things a bit more to get a better training effect, we had plenty of reserve capacity to be able to do that. So and both programs kind of evolve in their own directions, and after a while, that's kind of how we ended up with the programs being so different. I would say that it's likely that differences in mechanics have something to do with it. If you have somebody who is, say they're a fairly strong deadlifter, but they pull with a rounded back, in my experience, they're going to tend to be a little bit more on the low frequency side for deadlifting.
Yeah.
Even if they're not that great of a deadlifter, if they're just anthropometrically not built for that lift, it seems like it's a more taxing thing for them to do. I can't quantify that at this point, and I can't even really be super confident that that's a valid observation. I think it is. That's what I see. But it's not like we've tested it at this point or really tried to look into the statistics of it.
Definitely. And the reason that I love that comparison so much of Liz and Mark is because it just highlights how most people will probably start on a very broad general program, but it's the information and the data collected that helps you assess response to training and then make necessary adjustments. And it's just so amazing to see how two people can go in two completely different directions. And I really do enjoy bringing up that conversation and watching how that unfolded. It's very cool to see. So, Mike, thank you very much for being on the podcast today, man. I really enjoyed it. I apologize if I sound a little bit nasally. I'm getting quite sick, but I do appreciate you being on. Thank you so much for your time today, and we'll speak to you next time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.